Welcome to First Presbyterian's Insight class, where First Presbyterian's identity, faith, and values meet today's world. We are doing the classes on Zoom, of course, and all the recorded classes are available off the church website. Currently we're in a series about the Apostle Paul. It's a 6-part series. This is the 3rd class, and we have Gary Connors-Boe, retired minister and member of First Presbyterian, leading us in the class. Instead of giving Gary an introduction every week, I thought it'd be better to just give a Gary fun fact each week, since we have 6 weeks of the class. And today's Gary fun fact is that Gary rescued Olivia Newton-John during his days in Vietnam. And perhaps, Gary, you'd like to elaborate on that story? I'm sure I couldn't tell it nearly so well. So with that, Gary, welcome again, and look forward to your class, and thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the deal was, in a poker game, I won the orders to be the escort officer for the Georgie Jessel USO show. Georgie Jessel was an old vaudevillian who was a contemporary of George Burns and Jack Benny and Al Jolson, and he actually invented the telephone shtick that Bob Newhart used to good effect back in the in the late 50s and early 60s. Anyhow, Jessel had a couple of female singers with him and an accordion player, and we traveled all over Vietnam it was like a vacation from the war for me. It was 3 weeks out of flying helicopters, and we were headquartered in Da Nang, and we stayed at the Maya Court Hotel, which is where all the USO show performers stayed. They reserved the 2nd floor for those people who were in country, who were traveling around and visiting hospitals and so forth. And one night in the lounge, there were a couple of young women from Australia, sister act, and it was Olivia Newton-John and her sister, and this was before they were famous. And Jessel was talking to one of the sisters, and he asked her if she would be interested in coming to Hollywood and getting connected with an agent there, and she said that she would be. And he said, well, why don't you come with me into my room? His room was off of the lounge, and I'll let me see if I can find some connection. So the two went into his room, and about 30 seconds later, the door flies open and she comes out and she says, Mr. Jessel, I am not interested in that kind of conversation. and Jessel was a character. I didn't always like him, but he actually chased her around the couch, and I intervened and said, Mr. Jessel, I think that the young woman doesn't have any interest in having this conversation, and it's late, and maybe we have an early start, maybe you should go to bed. And at which point he fired me. Oh. And I said, well, that's fine, but I'll in the morning we'll find a replacement for me. He fired me nearly every day for some reason or other, so I didn't take it very seriously. Anyhow, she went to her room. I went to my room across the hall, and a little later on, I heard him pounding on her door. She was about 3 doors down, and I just thought, I'm not getting involved. I'm tired of this crap. I'm not getting involved. And the pounding would stop, and then it would start again, and then after a while, there was a little knock on my door, and so I opened it, and it was Olivia Newton-John, and she said, "Can I come in here? He's pounding on my door. Can I just stay in here a while he gets settled down?" And I said, "Sure." So she came in, and we visited for 45 minutes, maybe an hour, and had a lovely conversation. I don't remember much about the conversation, and And then I saw her the next morning as we were leaving and they were leaving, and I waved and she waved back. And so I rescued Olivia Newton-John in Vietnam.
An exciting story.
Yeah, that's Jessel was interesting because he, although he wasn't that talented in my estimation. He had a singing voice like Al Jolson, but he was known as the Toastmaster General of the United States, and he knew everybody. I mean, famous. And so you could throw out a famous name, and he would have a story about that person. And one of the things that and I believed them for the most part until he mentioned that Rock Hudson was gay. And who could believe that? I mean, this is 1969. Rock Hudson was not gay. Rock Hudson was a manly man. And I had grown up as a red, white, and blue kid who was disgusted by homosexuality, and I used gay slurs as much as any of my buddies did. And one night, I guess it was after Vietnam. Okay. Yeah, it was after Vietnam. I was in a bar in Panama City, Florida, with a young woman, and who got up to go into the ladies' room, and she was gone for a little bit. And while she was gone, some guy there who saw me sitting alone came over and sort of propositioned me. And I stood up and just hit him as hard as I could. My dad was a boxer and had taught us kids how to box, and so we knew how to to fight. The bartender jumped over the bar with a baseball bat and I said, "Hey, this faggot over here just hit on me." And at that, the bartender apologized, literally threw the guy out, And then when my date returned, she and I drank free for the rest of the time we were there. In seminary, in my senior year, we had some friends over, and we were going to play charades. And so my group, it was a warm spring day, and one group was going to stay outside and come up with their names and movie titles and so forth. And we were going to go into our seminary apartment. And on the way in, I don't recall the occasion, but I affected a stereotypical gay way of speaking. This is kind of a feminine thing. And the wife of one of my fellow students, Bev Reshen, turned around to me and looked horrified. And she said, "I can't believe what you just did." And I knew that was offensive. I kind of knew it was offensive. And I said, "Oh, Barb, come on." She said, "No, she said, if you had done that in the presence of your congregation, you would give them permission to be homophobic." Gary, I've admired you with regard to the issues you take with regard to world hunger and justice issues. But on this issue, you were just stupid and evil. And I was very embarrassed and angry. And I said, "Oh, Barb, come on, Barb, just," and she said, "No, really, you must be just stupid on this issue. And tomorrow I'm going to bring you some stuff for you to read so that you can be less stupid about it." And I was furious. I was embarrassed. And I said, "Well, Barb, I don't have time to." She said, "No, I'm gonna." Well, I had to work the next day. It was a Saturday. And while I was gone, she did bring over some things, and I refused to look at them. And it wasn't until a year or two later that I got into the parish at St. Stephen's here in Cedar Rapids. And somehow I found that stuff and began to look through it and realized that I was stupid and that my views about gay and lesbian persons were evil. And I began to read more. And what I learned was that for most men who are gay, the reasons have to do with biology. We all start out as females, as you people probably know. At about the 6 weeks of gestation, those of us who are going to become males develop testes. The testes begin to produce testosterone, and the testosterone helps to organize the male brain for typical heterosexual male orientation. And this happens during a 2-week window between the 6th and the 8th week. And for those of us for whom the testes develop at 6 weeks and begin producing testosterone, we are born with a brain that is stereotypically heterosexual. If for some reason the testes don't produce testosterone during that 2-week window, or they're late in developing and then don't produce testosterone until the 9th week, the brain, because we all start out as females, remains organized as a female brain for sexuality. So a person then can become, very masculine, have hair on the palms of their hands, but will have a brain that is organized for what we call homosexual rather than heterosexual activity. In females, it's a little different. There's a hormone apparently that's not testosterone that's produced sometimes as a result of kidney dysfunction that has the same effect as testosterone. If that is in the mother's system during that 6 to 8 week window, then apparently the brain becomes organized for typical male sexual orientation. And thus you have lesbianism. My daughter is gay, and so apparently that's what was happening with her. Anyway, heterosexuality is if we're going to blame somebody for that, then I guess we have to blame God for creating the arrangements by which this can happen. In the ancient world, homosexuals were not despised, or largely were not despised, and apparently in hunter-gatherer societies, men who are homosexual are regarded very highly, because when the men go off to do their hunting, and you'll have a male who can typically relate more to feminine activities, the gathering, which by the way produces more protein for the tribe than hunting does, but stays back, and that's a benefit to the tribe in the event that the tribe would be attacked by wild animals or other hunter-gatherers. So there's a whole lot more that can be said about that, but this is to say that homosexuality is not an evil thing. It's just a natural thing, and but we have Paul then who attacks homosexuality. And in the handout how many downloaded the handout? How many have looked at the handout?
I haven't.
Okay. I recommend that you do that. But in Romans 1:27, we hear this: men gave up natural intercourse with women, were consumed with passion for one another. Men committed shameless acts with men and received in their own persons a due penalty for their error. And in some of the non-Pauline epistles, we have similar kinds of arguments against homosexuality, but that's not what was going on, and that's not what caused Paul to write this. Pedophilia is what Paul is mostly talking about, and in Paul's time, the practice of pedophilia was rampant. It was very common in Greek and Roman mythology and also in daily life. Now, of course, pedophilia is defined as sexual attraction to children. And in modern times, we regard it as abhorrent behavior, and it is. It's even defined as a psychiatric disorder. But to the ancient Romans and Greeks, it was regarded as normal and even as ethically positive behavior. In Greek society, especially, a little bit more than in Roman society, an older man who was usually in his mid to late 20s, early 30s, was the pursuer of the relationship that was pedophilia, and the object of the pursuit was typically a child in early adolescence to mid-teens, and they were complicated and involved more than just sex. In some cases, pederasty was regarded as a civic duty, especially by men who were of higher caste. And it was regarded as a kind of mentorship. Part of the deal was that this all had to do with misogyny, really. Women were so lowly regarded by the ancient Greeks that to be in the company of women was thought of as being rather disgraceful. So men rather were likely to find themselves almost exclusively outside of the home in the company of males. And masculinity was a very prized feature of Greek life. And I, in some ways, I don't want to go there, but I was going to say that it was akin to the kind of relationships that sometimes you find among men in prison. But the deal was that among the elites, it was regarded as a kind of mentorship, as I said, and but among the lower classes, it was just straight up rape. Now, Jewish people had a very strong aversion to homosexuality, and that had to do with the fact that Israel, during its earlier and formative decades and centuries, was a small nation with a small population, and therefore anything that would work to stop people from being fruitful and multiplying, and thereby increasing the population, thereby increasing the number of men who are available to be conscripted into an army, was regarded as evil. And so masturbation and homosexuality were regarded by ancient Jews as being evil and offensive to God. And Paul, growing up as a Jewish kid, would have been raised to believe all of that. But in the Greek world, that was just not the case. And they were regarded, homosexual acts were regarded as being manly, actually, and they were all, and pederastic rape was considered a punishment, in fact, in as much as you'll recall that I said last week or the week before that upwards of 50% of the population of the Roman Empire was enslaved. In a machismo world, like the Greek world, pederasty was often a means of punishment, as if if you're going to act like a female, I'm going to treat you as a female. Okay. And in her book Paul Among the People by Sarah Rudin, Dr. Sarah Rudin, she notes that so common was pederastic rape in Paul's day that families of means would send bodyguards with their children as they walked to and from school. And she goes on to say that late at night during many of the annual festivals to the various gods, I love living in San Antonio because there was always something going on. It was Cinco de Mayo, or it was the Folklife Festival, or it was the National Fiddling Championships, or it was the Texas Chili Cook-Off, and every weekend there was some place to go and have some fun. And that's kind of how it was in the ancient Greek world. I mean, there were so many gods and goddesses that you could find a festival and an opportunity to revel and carouse and drink nearly every week. And during those bacchanals, it was unsafe for free or slave children to be anywhere near the roving bands of revelers, which is why in other places Paul inveighs against heavy drinking. He's referring to these street festivals and so forth. And so for Paul, homosexuality was pedophilia and rape committed primarily by otherwise heterosexual men who are treating God's beloved creatures simply as vessels for their sexual satisfaction and or their expression of masculinity and dominance. And this runs counter to Paul's conviction that each of us is to regard others as God's beloved sons or daughters and our brothers and sisters. I want to read to you something from what's known as the Sibylline oracles. These date to between the 2nd century BC and the middle of the 1st century, or middle of the 2nd century CE or AD. And the Sibylline oracles were something that Pharisees especially paid attention to and studied. And this is from the 2nd chapter of the Sibylline oracles. And it's talking about how the earth will be when God's final reign eventuates. The earth will belong equally to all, undivided by walls or fences. It will then bear more abundant fruit spontaneously. Lives will be in common, and wealth will have no division. There will be no poor man there, no rich, no tyrant, no slave. Further, no one will be either great or small anymore. No kings, no leaders. All will be on a par together. All will be regarded as the crown of God's creation. That's how Paul envisioned the kingdom of God. And pederastic rape obviously flew in the face of that noble vision for Paul. And thus, we read his injunctions against homosexuality, which are really for Paul injunctions against pederasty. Questions or comments about any of that? What do you think?
I think many people misinterpret the Bible and don't understand the culture when it was written. So many people condemn homosexualities and use the Bible as the reason.
So that's definitely a factor. I totally agree with you. And we all know this. That's definitely a factor in the Christian right. I mean, their two issues are abortion and gay marriage. And typically, I would say that those who are in that far Christian right don't want to know what the history and why and the culture at the time. They don't want to know it. They want to believe. They want to believe what they believe. Sorry, I know so many.
Is your interpretation of this writing, is that the mainstream interpretation? I don't know any of the scholarly understanding of these epistles, but could you characterize that?
Yeah, this is stuff that I learned from people like Borg and Crossan and Meyer and Kazemon and Kuhlmann, who are regarded as the as top of the line Pauline scholars. Also from the sociologists of the first century Mediterranean world, people like Bruce Molina and others. So yeah, it's you know, it's what would be taught in our seminaries these days,
But sometimes ministers have trouble getting that down to the congregation, don't you think? I mean, the congregation doesn't want to hear it.
no, they don't. And I know I get kind of emotional about this issue. I was as I was going through the stuff that I just talked about, I was getting a little tongue-tied because my emotions were running rampant through my intellectual side. As I said, my daughter is gay, but I lost a job over this issue. And by going to bat for gay and lesbian persons. In fact, I may have lost a couple of jobs over this issue. But I just found myself not able to look myself in the mirror unless I spoke up on behalf of gay and lesbian persons and argued some of what you've just heard me argue. And you know, it's remarkable to me that I could come from a place of very rabid homophobic belief and behavior to a place where I'd be willing to lose a job over this issue and supportive. But that's, you know, that's what the gospel has freed me to do. That's what the information about all of this has allowed me to do. So anyway.
This was such a big issue at our church back in Michigan, as the ministry there tried to foster more acceptance of homosexual and gay and lesbian participants in our service, and leaders at our church camp and our music department. They were helping the camp director, who was a lesbian and had a partner living with her in the house up at the camp, work for ordination. She was a former New York cop, and yeah. She was great at the camp, but it was such a divisive issue that we lost quite a few members from our congregation as the church evolved into a more accepting posture. And there were some who just could not overcome that revulsion, I guess. Some of it had come from their own experiences, like you said, where they were approached by someone back in college and had built a wall that they couldn't ever come through. But when we got out to Colorado Springs, we had come from this inclusive church, this church where the faith of these homosexual members was such a huge part of what made our church rich and talented, that we got to Colorado Springs and we specifically went looking for a church that was inclusive. It was almost impossible to find one. And when
In Colorado Springs,
in Colorado Springs, we finally
the
ended
home
up
of the Air Force Academy.
Yeah, we ended up at a church out at Monument, just north of the Air Force Academy, that was sounding a little bit more inclusive. And then they had a youth minister come in who was adamant that this was a sin. And I finally lost it and talked to the head pastor and said, you know, this is not something that I can listen to and accept. And at the time, the General Assembly was dealing with the issue of whether or not they could ordain homosexuals as pastors. And the head of the Colorado Springs Church wrote a letter saying that he was going to take at least 6 churches and start his own denomination. It was, and this was what, 8 years ago, maybe?
Wow.
Not very long ago.
Yeah.
I don't know whatever happened to that, whatever happened to who owned which building, but the guy who had the 5,000 member congregation in downtown Colorado Springs and the radio ministry was a big voice for leaving the denomination over this issue.
What would Paul say about that?
What would Paul say?
Many of you know that I taught for 26 years in Southern Baptist College in Oklahoma. And Oklahoma is the most, if you live there, you arguably the most conservative state in the union. And I taught in a music department. Think about that. And I taught a lot of Southern Baptist ministers' kids, right? Because they went to the university. And I can't tell you the heartache that a lot of the student there, you know, I started running into really fine students very early in my career who were struggling with and being told all the time that, you know, that they were evil. I mean, not personally, but that's why they didn't come out, right? Okay. And struggling with who they were, to the point where in the 90s, there was one of our most talented, wonderful students got beat up in a gay park in Oklahoma City and was over time later expelled because it was known that he was in a homosexual park and he was getting ready to finish his degree and they expelled him like within, you know, 2 semesters because he wouldn't take part in their conversion therapy. And I got into trouble. So Gary, I mean, I didn't lose my job because I was tenured, but I certainly put myself out there going to bat for this young man. And it was one of the major reasons why I said, you know, in a few years after that, I'm not staying here anymore because of the way that these people are being treated. And it was both boys and girls. I mean, I had one of my best composition students over the years, Southern Baptist preacher's kid, sat in my living room about 10 years after she graduated from college and cried and told me about her journey. I mean, it is absolutely horrible what the Christian right does to people. And, you know, they suffer for years and years and years on this. And it's just, it's disgusting. It's horrible. Sorry, I just. brings up-
I appreciate that. I was in 1990, 91, I think, I presided at a couple of gay, not weddings, because same-sex
no-
marriage was not legal in Iowa, but at committal service between two gay couples in the church I was serving in Ames. And word got to, I told this story the other day, but word got to the university that I was gay-friendly clergy, and I was asked to do the invocation for National Coming Out Day in 1991 or two. I can't remember the year, but at any rate, I did that. They had 10 speakers, and then me doing the invocation for a minute or so. And my picture was in the paper then the next day, both the student paper and the town paper. And the following week, 20 families left the congregation I was working for. I sort of survived that, but then was the subject of a heresy trial, which I won. We had people from seminary come and support me, but it resulted in my eventually deciding to leave. And then a few years later, I was working as a chaplain at the Newton Correctional Facility and went to bat for a couple of gay inmates who were celibate but were being abused by a program that was trying to pray them into heterosexuality. And I went to bat for them and lost that job as well. And I knew I would, and I loved that job. But again, you have to look at yourself in the mirror. So this is a very emotional issue for me, and one that I've done a 180 on, and thank goodness. And it's painful for me to talk about my beating a guy up in a bar and having the feelings I did, but it's also a testament to the power of the gospel, to change lives and the power of witnessing.
I'm curious, Gary. A few years ago, we the session worked through this, and at one point I said something to Heather about we were talking about, would we do gay marriage? Had nothing to do with gay membership. Would we allow
Right.
gay marriage in the church? And Mike may be able to help me on this. I don't even remember what the outcome was. I think the decision, it was left up to the pastor. But at one point I said to Heather, doesn't Paul say something about nothing can separate us from God's love?
That's exactly right. Romans 8. Yeah.
So how does Paul rationalize saying nothing can separate us from God's love, and at the same time say homosexuality is bad?
Well, again, Paul is not talking about homosexuality per se. He may, as a Jew, have been opposed to homosexual relationships, but that's not what he's dealing with in his admonitions against homosexuality. He's dealing with the very common and accepted practice of child rape.
Okay.
And if Paul was opposed to homosexuality that did not involve rape, then we as 21st century persons can say, well, Paul was wrong about that. In the same way that we can say that Paul was wrong in his belief that the earth was flat. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, the
So-
interesting thing is that Jesus never said anything against homosexuality.
He doesn't, and the reason he doesn't is because in Palestine, the conditions that I spoke about with reveling and pederasty did not exist among the Jewish persons who lived there. So it was not an issue for Jesus. But you know what? I didn't intend to talk about this, but abortion was. Abortion was quite common in Jesus' day. And Jesus never says boo about it, nor does Paul.
I think it's interesting that we define ourselves as Christian and to follow Jesus, and then we don't, you know, if we're actually following Jesus, we should think about what Jesus said.
Well, and follow his example as well. Well, I think we probably need to move on. We've just got a few minutes left, and obviously we're not going to get through. So let me ask you the other issues that the handout treats and that I intended to talk about today had to do with Paul and women and slavery and this business about people should obey the governing authorities. Which of those things would you like to talk about in the last few minutes that we have together?
Women?
Women?
I would.
Can we extend this series by like about 6 weeks so that we can really? Just kidding.
Well, that would be fine with me. I extended the series for
We did that
4 months. Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
Well, I was just telling Nancy, we actually did that. Didn't we start out with a 5-week series in August and finished up the second week of January?
That's about right. Yeah, that's about right. Which was fine with me, but I don't think that would work with the Insight schedule for this year. Well, let's just then talk. I encourage you to read the handout because there's some fairly important information there with regard to our deciding whether or not Paul was appealing or appalling. And just as an overview, I will tell you that with respect to slavery, with 50% of the population being enslaved in Paul's day, and with slavery being akin, as I think I may have said last week, to our to our power grid system, our sewer system, our factory system, our farm system. I mean, everything ran on slave power in those days. And if Paul had come out against slavery in general, he would not have lasted 2 days. He would have been either completely ignored or executed. Crucifixions were only meted out to people who were convicted of sedition or who were runaway slaves or who were challenging the slave system in Roman times. And so Paul would have ended up much earlier than he otherwise might have. Some think Paul was crucified in Rome in the early 60s, but he would have been immediately executed. So what he does is he encourages Christians who own slaves to treat their slaves as their brothers and sisters, and he suggests in the letter that he writes to the slave owner Philemon that it would be better if he had no slaves. With regard to the Romans 13 business about obeying the government in power, let every person be subject to the governing authority, for there is no authority except from God, and those authorities that have existed have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Do you wish to have no authority? Then do what is good, and you'll receive its approval. That business, which is just ridiculous. Rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Really? Can you think of a ruler in history who was a terror to good conduct? Does one come to mind? Pol Pot, Adolf Hitler, the rulers of Turkey during the Armenian massacre. come on. What's going on is that, as I say in this handout, that Nero has just been appointed the new emperor, and there's lots of political intrigue going on. He's just murdered his 17-year-old brother Britannicus, and there is a civil war that is being talked about in Rome, and what Paul is concerned about is that the Christian communities in Rome, who have no love for Nero, will join an armed insurrection and be part of doing violence. And Paul is in lockstep with Jesus that violence is no longer to be a way that we solve our problems. Jesus was a pacifist, and so was Paul. And so he's saying, please, don't, he overreacts in his concern that Christians in Rome will take up arms and use violence to solve their problems. And in the chapter that precedes Romans 13, chapter 12, you'd almost think it was Jesus who's writing this rather than Paul. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. This is so Jesus in the 12th chapter, and such was his concern that people would not follow in the footsteps of their Lord, that he writes this stuff that has been used throughout history, to pardon the blood-soaked excesses of tyrants. So women, and we're out of time, unfortunately. But please read this part of the handout, because contrary to the notion that Paul was a misogynist, he was not a misogynist. And I'll just mention one quick example of that. When Paul writes his most important letter, that is to say, the letter to the Romans that we'll be looking at, he sends it to Rome with Phoebe, who was a deacon at the suburb of the suburb of Corinth called Cenchreae. And what the person who delivered an epistle of this sort, or an epistle generally, was required to do was to read it to the congregation, well, to the recipients. And in this case, it was the several Christian congregations in Rome. Now, if Phoebe is going to be reading this, she's not going to be silent in the congregation, which in Corinthians has parentheses around it, because most scholars don't believe that Paul wrote this, that it was a later edition. That's why the parentheses are there in the New Revised Standard Version, in the Old Revised Standard Version, and in several other translations. The other thing that Phoebe would have been required to do was to answer questions about it, to explain it, not just to read it, to be the parish theologian. So that's just one small example of how Paul regarded women completely as his partners in his missionary activities. The other thing to say is that Lydia was the leader of the church in Philippi, and Priscilla was his partner, along with her husband, in their missionary activity in Ephesus. And it's believed by some that it was Priscilla who wrote the New Testament book that we know as Hebrews. So that's just a shorthand for shorthand argument against Paul being a misogynist. And so I think that on balance, we can say that Paul, rather than be appalling, which Paul is in some of the non-Pauline letters, where people want to kind of water down what the radical Paul has said, but the genuine Paul was really a radical and very much in step with his Lord, and very, to me, and I hope to you, appealing. I'm done.
Thank you very
Thank
much,
you.
Gary. And we have time to get some coffee and get to the service, which starts here in a few minutes. I've heard a rumor that Heather is going to try to do her sermon live this week, so we'll see how that goes. Thanks again, Gary, for a great class, and look forward to next week's class too.
Yeah, thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Gary.
Gary.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah.
Gary.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But,
Have a great week.
yeah, you too.
It was very good.